today I have a very exciting panel. I have the legendary Prof. Wieland Gevers himself. Welcome, Prof. I have Professor Denver Hendricks. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
And our very own Dr. Michael Gastrow. So today we have some areas in the fields of medical biochemistry, and we also have our very own Michael Gastrow, who has experience in science and society. So specifically, Michael's research is on the public perceptions of science. And we really want to speak and hear everyone's opinions and everyone's input on science and its particular impact in answering questions, some philosophical questions about the meaning of life. So on that note, I'd like to go to Professor Wieland Gevers and ask you, Prof, why now? Why did you want to write a memoir, and why did you want to write this book now? What was so important about this time?
Yes, thank you. Essentially, I want to point out that the book is not written in a sense for my own purposes. I intended it to write at the end of a very long career, activities all the time which are described in the book. I wanted to write in order to be able to reach out to others who may be in earlier phases of their careers and who may want to reflect on what it means to live and to try to set out to achieve goals and essentially make sense of the world in relation to yourself, but also in relation to others and to society in general. So, if I can just start literally with myself, as now 87, but as a small child. That's what I don't say in the book is that I had an exceptionally vivid imagination and fantasized a great deal. And one of the things conclusions I came to at a very young age was that there was this self in me which was able to examine my surroundings and examine my position in the surroundings and examine what others were thinking, what's now called theory of mind and so on, all included in that. And so from early on, I developed the habit of continually placing what I was doing in the context of the world and of other people, and of setting out to discover what I could do. And it's important that is what I set out to do. Now, one doesn't know at an early age what you can do. And of course, I was lucky that I was born into a German South African family, and there's a middle-class German tradition which is called Bildung, and the word means the cultivation of yourself in terms of everything that you can know and everything that you can, all the skills you can acquire, and all the things that you are able to do creatively. And so, therefore, that was an idea that I had from an early age, that is what I should be doing, is exploring what I can do in my life. So, just to come to your question now, so the book is a series of events in my life. Each time I'm reaching out to learn something new, each time to explore a different world. And so, unlike some people whose lives are smooth from beginning to end, predictable and in the same place, etc., I got into all kinds of different situations, all kinds of new situations, which I start almost at the bottom, and see what I could make of it, and what I could learn, and what I could do, and what I could contribute. And so I felt that it's important to put this down, to capture it in much more detail, of course, than I'm now able to do, but nevertheless to try to see whether others would be able to get some inspiration from that, some kind of inspiration that you mustn't be scared of testing yourself against the world and seeing maybe you're much better than you think you are.
And that I can attest to and I can appreciate as a very new, early emerging scholar. There is a lot of insight that can be learned from you reflecting on years and years of being a scientist. And science has kind of been a big narrative in your life. So maybe if you can reflect on when you first started with science and what impact did it have on your narrative of life, if you reflect on it.
Yes. Well, essentially, the position is that I was an all-rounder because of this philosophy of wanting to explore everything as a young person. So that I couldn't decide what I was going to do when I left school because there were so many things I was interested in doing. And so eventually I decided to do medicine because it seemed to offer the best opportunity of working with people and having a scientific basis of that interaction, and to be able to make a contribution of new discoveries and new ways of treating people better. So in the course of my medical studies, I actually enjoyed particularly the way in which certain lecturers were able to show that there was a scientific logic to what they discovered was wrong with the patient, and there was a scientific logic in how the patient should be treated, and what treatments were available and what treatments might be available if one had some other knowledge. And I found that enormously stimulating, so that at the end of my medical studies, while I enjoyed practicing medicine, I thought that I would now become a scientist, and there was an opportunity to do that by going to Oxford University and studying with the Nobel Prize when they told me to have that. Yeah.
And I mean, for many people, there's this contrast between the hard sciences and the soft sciences, physics and philosophy. So I'd like to hear from you, Prof. Denver Hendricks. You are from the field of, or the discipline, I should say, of medical biochemistry. Also the hard sciences. Have you ever reflected on the meaning of life, and has your discipline and your interest shaped how you question it?
Absolutely. That will take me a little longer to answer that question. But in the book I explain exactly the unfolding, the endless unfolding, because the beauty of science is that it is the one human endeavor in which we behave like nice people. If I can compare with all the other human activities, this is the one place where there is a community of people who agree on a basic rule that they won't publish things that aren't so, and they will correct things, mistakes that have been made, they will build on previous knowledge, they will publish their work, and they will seek to work together if they can put their skills together, etc. So it's a community which makes fantastic sense. But it's also a way of endlessly finding out more, unfolding secrets, unfolding the mysteries that are behind this natural world in which we live. So therefore, far from being a medical biochemist, I was actually very much broader than that, in the sense that I was fascinated by many, many things, particularly that you're not an automaton. You have to position yourself as a human being in the world, and you have to form a model that is scientifically sound of how society works and where we come from and why we do things the way we do and what are better ways of doing things. So I've always been interested in evolution and in human societies and in much broader questions. So, and that is because of my belief that the scientific inquiry is able to give us answers.
I would like to ask Prof. Denver Hendricks, maybe you can reflect on your discipline and how that has almost helped you contemplate the meaning of life, which is something very existential. But in your reflection, I'd also like you to think and reflect on what impact Prof. Wieland had on your life in terms of connecting or intersecting the science or the philosophical.
Sure. And so, in two parts really, looking back at my training as a biochemist, as a scientist, and looking at my background is really in biochemistry, but I also come from a zoology background. And so I already came into the biochemical society environment having a very strong understanding of evolution and how that explained life as we knew it. And I think when we try and explain life as it is, most people tend to look at religion to try and understand life and where it came from and the meaning of life. For a long time, evolution didn't really fit into that understanding as it was constructed many, many years ago, but for many of us, 2,000 years ago. My view is that I very readily took to the idea that evolution explained a lot of what we saw in living systems around us. And it was easy because of the science that I became integrated in as part of the Department of Medical Biochemistry, where we really try to understand the essence of what life is and how it worked. Of course, even right now, understanding the little bits and pieces of what life is constructed of doesn't really talk to the issue of the mind and consciousness and what it's all about. And I think what became quite important at that point is, although I didn't really work on those things in little test tubes in the laboratories in Prof. Gevers' department, it's the social environment that was created that became quite important, because it was in those conversations that we spoke after hours and on runs and in conversations at people's places that people spoke about these issues. And space was created for people to kind of construct their own meaning and test that and follow that. And so I have a very particular view of how I understand life that comes from that spaces that were created then. Talking to the second point, which was, what impact Wieland has had on my life, and we spoke about this earlier on when, in fact, it really started 1981 when I was a third-year student at UWC, 1981 being a point in South Africa's history where we had the height of repression, apartheid repression. UWC had quite a bit of student action demonstrations and student action on campus, and so we were part of that. And it's then I contemplated doing the next phase, entering the next phase of my life, because I was completing my third year and looking to see whether I'd actually follow a career as a zoologist, because my one major was zoology and I was quite enthusiastic about zoology, as Wieland would know, but I was also equally enthusiastic about biochemistry. And my third year lecturer at that point was in fact a graduate from Wieland's department, Arlene Smith. She taught me in third year and she made the biochemistry very exciting, encouraged me to visit Wieland's department, and when I visited him, he was adamant that I will pass my third year and that I would come and do honors with him in 1982, which I did do. I finished my BSc and then joined the medical biochemistry honors program, and at that point the honors program was held in our coffee room, our tea room, around a long table, and there were 12, 13, 14 of us sitting around the table with Wieland at the head of the table, and we were from UCT Biochemistry, Stellenbosch Biochemistry, WITS, Free State, and UWC. Very, very unsettling. I was completely uncertain of whether I would be able to manage, but the kind of space that Wieland created then was one where he cared immensely for his students. And I immediately felt that even though, this was my thinking, of course, and that's not what he said, that even though I came from UWC, I had a contribution to make, because the nature of the biochemistry that were taught, it was different from what was being taught at UCT and WITS. And so I could talk to the strengths of where I came from. And it kind of gave me confidence, and it made me feel that this place was my home. I stayed there for a long time. Most of those grey hairs on Wieland's head is because of our class. We gave him a bit of a hard time. And I finished the honours, did masters and PhD in the department, and I had a wonderful time. And so the way Wieland taught, the Socratic approach, where he kind of expected us to read fairly difficult papers and ask teasing questions going around the table, kind of forced us to come out of our shell and answer questions and become part of a discussion. That really had a huge impact on the way I saw what teaching was about and how I taught afterwards. And that stayed with me forever. And maybe just, I'm not quite sure if you know Wieland, but the director of research at UCT, Linda Mtwisha, I'm pretty sure you may have met her already. So she came up to me about 3 or 4 years ago when she just joined UCT. She came to me and says, "Hey, Denver, do you remember me?" And I'd in fact taught her in her second and third at UWC. And she says, "You know, you had such a huge impact on her life and the way you taught." And she said, "I completely piqued her interest in research and science, and this is why she decided to go and do masters and PhD." So it's Wieland's impact.
Me teaching the honors class with Denver in the picture.
But you know, there's something very interesting that you mentioned that I actually just I want you to elaborate on. So oftentimes we think that there is this divide between the natural and the social sciences. But what you're saying is that magic happens and impact is created when those two worlds converge. Because you were talking about the spaces that Wieland created, which wasn't all just about science. There were places for you to engage, to talk, and I think that's something really important that we need to think about, and how artificial the boundary between the natural and social sciences are.
Absolutely.
Definitely. So, Michael, I'd love to hear from you, from your perspective and from your discipline, particularly in science, how that has maybe brought you to question on the meaning and the purpose of life.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. It's been a pleasure hearing about Wieland's impact in the world of science. And it's an interesting discussion where you bring together philosophical ideas and ideas about science, which is based on a method. And, you know, it's something that's explored a lot in the philosophy of science, and real attempts to unpack the meaning side, the conceptual side of what is meaning in principle. I think that's a deep area of thought and philosophy. But in science, the meaning is achieved through the production of some form of new knowledge in most cases, and then that knowledge has some kind of impact in the world, whatever it is, whether it's a new medicine or whether it's something else. It has changes often through tech, but not always. And I guess then the question becomes how do these things articulate? How do your values, your principles, your goals, your beliefs, your own desires for yourself and for the world, how do those line up with the knowledge that's being produced and the impact that you're having in the world? That's the kind of nexus. And I think is evidently the case for Wieland, and is certainly an aspiration for most scientists, I think, is to get those things in a nexus where the knowledge you're producing and the impact that you're having is really positive according to your principles, according to what it is that you want to do in the world. And I think that's it's a very powerful space to be in if those things are aligned, and it can give you individual meaning and social meaning at the same time. And of course that varies a lot across different disciplines and has its own limitations.
So I think maybe at some point in your life, those two worlds will converge. So Prof, you mentioned in the book, close to the end of the book, you say, this shift of mental emphasis from professional to personal concerns is illustrated by my relationship to the progress of science. And I want you to reflect on that statement and maybe answer the question of whether there was a defining moment in your professional or personal experience that really shaped or reshaped your perspective on life?
I'll answer the second one perhaps first. The defining moment was when I had obviously enjoyed and had an enormous amount of pleasure from teaching and researching, and found that was a very satisfying life, which gave me meaning because I was not only living but getting a lot of feedback from people that they were gaining and they were feeling happy as well and so on. But I then thought that maybe your contribution can be bigger and on another scale and in another way. So when I was invited to apply for an administrative post at UCT, one of the deputy vice chancellor posts, the opportunity arose to be the person responsible for the academic process, as it was called, academic affairs, which meant teaching and learning. And that gave me the opportunity of trying to examine the way in which students learnt, in particular at the critical time when there was an enormous influx of black students into the university system who had, generally speaking, not been well prepared for university study. For many reasons, but we won't go into that, but there's no doubt that they were talented, but they didn't have the preparation and the experience to be able to handle the old curricula, the old model. So therefore it was imperative both to see whether one could improve the teaching models and the teaching curricula and the teaching approach. This is all before technology came, of course. And so it meant that I could actually ask a question of the university, because it had some faculties, medicine, law, commerce, engineering, where the faculty teaching staff would spend days and days mulling over what courses should the students take and what should they learn and what should they be able to do when they have taken these courses. Whereas the so-called for-credit faculties, like the BA, teaching the BA and the B social science and BSc, would simply say you've got to have 18 credits at each level, and you must, if you're doing this major, you must have this minor, and there's the rules, but then you can do what you like. Depending on the timetable, when you get up out of bed, you take the courses that you like, that you've heard are easy to do, all that sort of thing. I'm caricaturing it a bit, as you realize. But nevertheless, it was an attempt to see whether those faculties would also sit down and reflect on what was it that their degrees, when awarded, actually had enabled their students to do in a reproducible, testable way. And not just saying, well, you've done English 3, done psychology 3, go into the world and see what the world does for you. But actually some kind of idea as to what it meant. You must remember this is also a time when the ANC government was very interested in outcomes-based education. So to some extent what I was proposing was an outcomes-based approach. So I'm just saying that you asked about a defining moment. That was a defining moment when I wanted to generalize into a system what I had previously been doing at the personal level. Now there'd be I wouldn't be interacting with individuals, I'd be interacting with people who run courses that individuals take. And that led me into a long history described in the book of battling which is still not finished in a sense, of trying to ensure that the initial bachelor degree is actually an enabling degree that is useful in the world and that empowers people to be able to do things that they need to do and want to do. And that will take the economy and the society to a better place. And so, without going into details, that I then represented that all the universities in South Africa on the South African Qualifications Authority, called SAQA. And that is where we were able to protect the idea that higher education qualifications can't be broken up into small bits and pieces, like vocational qualifications can. You can become an electrician because you took this course and that course and that course and this course, this certificate, that makes you a qualified electrician. Not so with higher education, especially if you're planning it carefully and trying to achieve goals. So therefore they accepted the principle that there would be an NQF, a National Qualification Framework, in which there would be whole qualifications in higher education, but they would be outcomes based, because they'd be pitched at different levels on the framework, so that a level 7 qualification would be a qualification in which there would be some experience of doing research. Give an example.
Yes, I was going to ask you for an example.
Yeah, that's an example. The PhD, for example, at the moment, most people think a PhD is you go off for 5 years and you have a supervisor somewhere and you research something in great intensity and you produce a thesis and you send it to examiners and they say, okay, and then you get a PhD. We said that's not good enough. You've got to define what does a person with a doctoral degree, what can you expect that person to be able to do? Should that person already have supervised the younger, like honor students' projects, so that they've got some idea of how to supervise people, not just work on their own? And secondly, should they have published papers? Should they have written papers and drafted them, and not just have been part of the boss's authored papers? Should they have had some experience of drafting a proposal, a research proposal, etc.? So I'm giving examples of how we try to define what in fact these degrees should mean. And most of that was adopted. Incompletely, I'm afraid to say, but nevertheless it made a big difference to the system. And now when a new proposal made by a university of a new course, they have to say how this will work in the NQF before it's approved. And so that was a defining moment when I was able to make a contribution to the system, to the national system, and I help a lot of people at once, without actually knowing them, and for generations to come, sort of thing. Now, if you go back to your other question, is that that's a bit more vague in the sense that I have always, as I answered you earlier, I've always been intensely interested in everything. So my discipline, biochemistry, I did as my central interest. And Denver vouched for the fact that I read journals like crazy, and I knew most of what I had to know. But I also was somebody who did performing arts. I read poetry, I played the piano, and I did other things. But I also was very interested in social science. I was very interested in the interaction between social science and hard science. So in fact, at a graduation, the former president of the HSRC, Professor Crane Sudin, was there when I gave the graduation lecture to the social science faculty when they were all graduating, which is called the Human Genome, the Social Sciences, and where we go from here. So I'm intensely interested in how much you can, in fact, achieve by acknowledging that the hard sciences tell you much but not all.
Yeah.
And the social sciences tell you much but not all. And they need each other in order to be able to sort out reality. So I gave the example that if you have a Russian visitor to South Africa and you invite him to Newlands to watch a rugby game, and you don't tell him what the rules are of rugby, this poor person will be sitting there watching 30 people throwing a ball around. And so there's actually a joke saying that the Russian eventually said, why don't they give each person a ball? He said, they haven't all chase one ball. So that's what you have when you have an incomplete sphere of knowledge. So I'm very much this consilience between disciplines, and in fact I promoted sport science is one of those disciplines which came out of my department, which we nurtured from the beginning with Tim Noakes until there was a Sports Science Institute of South Africa at Newlands. And that had fantastic academic potential because you had to have physiologists and biochemists and nutritionists and psychologists, and all had to work together on sports science. So that is why I was always very turned on by the notion that you had to bring things together. And when we formed the academy,
Most of the other African countries have got academies of science, which is hard science. But when we formed our South Africa, the new South African Academy for the new South Africa, we formed it as an academy of all the sciences that inquire after truth and knowledge. Social, humanities. If you're an historian, we have historians in our academy who use the historiography, who use history as science, as scholarship. So that's why that breadth is very crucial to me.
And I think the connotation is that science is only hard science, when actually it is the social sciences, it is your history, your creative arts, all of that. There's something important that you mentioned where you said you tried to change or affect change in the system from, just a tick box exercise of having or getting a degree to something that was more outcomes based, and you wanted to reflect on the skills. And I wanted to add, because you said it's an incomplete process and journey. And also just to add that I think it will always be incomplete because it's a continuous process, right? It's not a static process. It's something that has to emerge and change as society changes. Yeah. And the skills that graduates need is going to change all the time. So I do think it's a continuous process.
That is one of the lessons that I learned. I mean, essentially, the present age of the artificial intelligence and fourth industrial revolution, those are such game changers that the rules are now completely different. I tried to teach my way. I went back to teaching people in the medical school, and I found that I just couldn't do it with these new methods. Just not able to use them. So I was a person of my time. But nevertheless, I think that the fact that there was a change in the system as a whole makes it more prepared for the changes that have to come.
Yeah, because you want to build the skills and capabilities, right? Yeah. Thanks, Prof. I just want to go to Prof. Hendricks. I want you also to reflect on your career and whether you found yourself going on one particular path at some point in time and whether there was a defining moment that made you shift that path.
So I think one of the defining moments was in fact the point where I decided that I would go and do medical biochemistry at UCT in the Faculty of Health Sciences. And it was making this decision as to whether I'd follow zoology or go into biochemistry. Biochemistry was much more challenging the way it was taught at UWC, and it was exciting. Unfortunately, the way zoology was taught was kind of more by rote learning, unfortunately, although the field is hugely exciting, and we're living in Africa in the first place, but secondly, we're living in the Western Cape, the Cape Floral Kingdom, where everything is so unique, and it could be different. But the way it was taught was, unfortunately, at that point, was not where it is right now. So things have changed. But I moved into biochemistry, and in a sense, my life has changed, and I became a biochemist. I spent 7 years, I think, in medical biochemistry, did my degrees there. And Wieland came to me at that point when I was nearing the completion of my PhD. He says, right, Denver, you need to think about what's going to be happening next, and we can arrange for you to go and do a postdoc. And it was Peter Jones that you spoke about at that point, who is also mentioned in the book. And he's over, it was Los Angeles then, San Francisco. And I could go and do a postdoc at that point. And given the time, given where I come from, I told Gila, no, I want to go and teach. I want to go and teach back at UWC. And so that was another change in direction. At that point, I'd made a decision that I wanted to go back to UWC. I felt that I'd learned a lot in medical biochemistry, and I wanted to give back some of what I'd gained back at UWC. So I went to UWC and Wieland and his colleagues helped me apply for a position, because at that point a position was becoming available in the department that I'd done my undergrad degree in, and I then applied for a position there. And I got the position in biochemistry at UWC, and I went to go and teach biochemistry back at the place where I'd done my UWC. But essentially taking the skills and the approach of what I'd picked up in medical biochemistry, some of it, and try to apply it into an undergraduate program, and taught the second years and third years biochemistry, started an honors program, and started a small research program. It was immensely interesting and exciting. But that shift going from UWC to UCT was a big one. The next shift going from UCT back to UWC was another big shift, where I then shifted into a teaching mode and starting a research program together with a colleague of Wieland's, Professor Iqbal Parker. So I kept my links with UCT, Faculty of Health Sciences. And in fact, while I was teaching the second years, I just remembered now, at second year biochemistry, second year biochemistry and third year biochemistry. Second year biochemistry, you do all these metabolic pathways, which can be terribly boring, as somebody can tell you, but they can also be immensely exciting. And of course, the excitement is being able to touch the things, being able to see the things, being able to relate to things. And I had somebody at UCT who had worked with a person who had discovered one of those metabolic pathways. That was a Krebs cycle. Wieland's a PhD supervisor. And so when we were teaching those pathways, I then invited Wieland to come over and speak about his work with Sir Hans Krebs in Oxford and talk a bit about it. And those things then just become a bit more tangible and a bit more real. And so I was very lucky in a sense in having access. And in fact, Wieland was quite busy at that period, but he came all the way from UCT, came down to UWC, came to my class and came with a little manometer, glass bottles, and showed the students how people went about defining these pathways which look unchanging in a textbook, but in fact were a research explored, and at some point often still there's a bit of uncertainty about things, because unfortunately the way we teach things, sometimes we tend to teach things as the gospel, unchanging, never changing, whereas in fact things are always changing and things are always evolving as we define new technologies, as we better refine our questions. And so there have been many changes. I mean, after 7 years teaching at UWC, I kind of felt that I didn't want to be at UWC just because I couldn't be elsewhere. So I decided that I would then go and explore the possibility of doing some research at in the USA. Went around, took a bit of leave, traveled around, looked for money, managed to find some money at the NIH, and I went to go and spend 5 years at the NIH working in a laboratory doing cancer research. I think it may be a bit more difficult to find that kind of money now, given Trump's
yes,
influence.
definitely.
But at that point, it was not too difficult to go in and speak to people on a basis of having personal interaction, being able to find some money, work in a research lab at the NIH, and then come back, and at that point, coming back to UCT. And so, there have been a number of shifts and changes in my life, which did require one to think very differently. In a sense, some of that, in a small way, reflected some of the bigger changes that Wieland spoke about in his book. But having made those shifts, you kind of always find that there are people willing to help and help you push, help you find ways to connect with people.
So there's another thing that you touched on that I want to ask you about before I go on to Michael. I want you to reflect on your teaching and how your time with Prof. Wieland shaped your teaching philosophy.
Yeah. So the teaching that I became familiar with at medical biochemistry was of a form where we kind of sat around a long table, 12 of us with a lecturer, and particularly referring to Wieland's style, where we'd be given, and so what we had is we had 10 modules for the year, and the modules were divided up into like 2 or 3 week batches, mostly 3 week batches, and we'd get reading for that 3 weeks, and we knew what we were going to be discussing each day, And so you'd come prepared for the paper in the day in question, and Wieland would sit over there and Wieland would say, so Denver, tell me, what do you think? I mean, why do you think they use this particular buffer for this particular, experiment? And you would have read through things, and we kind of had those kind of questions or similar kind of questions before. So you'd kind of, think a bit about what had happened, think through things, answer questions. Sometimes your answers were wrong, but I never ever got from Wieland, oh, what a stupid answer, It was always encouraging and always supportive. And it was always this allowing space for interaction between yourself and the supervisor and yourself and other students. So when I went, and of course that continued in the master's and PhD, but in a different form because you're now interacting with your supervisor. When I went to UWC, you're sitting with a class of, at second year level, maybe 90 students, and more depending on how it grew. And in your third year level, maybe 30 or 40 students. It becomes a bit more difficult to do that kind of approach, but I tried. So what I did is if we do a block of lipid biology for the next 3 weeks, I would, and so it takes a lot of time beforehand, and I know Wieland did this for his undergraduate teaching as well. Write down day by day what material is covered in the textbook, what information they needed to know, and questions that's associated with that teaching for the day. Do that for the whole 3 weeks, and I have a little booklet that would be about this thick. So when the students came to the class the first day, they'd get their booklet. And I said, look, I'd explain to them what I'm going to be doing. First day of teaching, not much teaching, but the next day, there's work that I expected them to do. And I'd stand in front, and the first thing I'd do is I'd get them to sit in little groups there and there. There's this group of 80 people would sit in groups of, they turn to one another, and they'd go through the material that they were supposed to go through last night. And I'd then move around the class, check that they'd done it, then I'd come back to the front, and then I'd ask that group, I wouldn't ask a person, I'd ask that group to nominate somebody to give their answer to the first question. And so we'd move around the class. It's not very efficient because it takes a time to do that. But it allowed for much more interaction, allowed space for people to ask questions.
Yeah.
And that's how the experience in Wieland's department affected the way I saw my teaching. Interactive, lots of interaction with one another, interaction with the lecturer. And that happened at second year level, but it happened more effectively at third year level when the class size was smaller.
Thanks for sharing that. So, Michael, I'd love you to reflect on your kind of academic journey, where it started and how you ended up in the field of science and society and looking at the public perceptions of science and scientific impact in society. If you could just reflect on that, and whether in that journey was there ever a key event or a moment that made you shift towards the direction to be where you currently are now?
Sure. Yeah, it's been a long journey. I think initially also I was quite skeptical about the idea of being an academic. But slowly grew accustomed to that fate. In science and society, what it is that we do is study the institutions of science themselves, and technology, which is applied science, it's like the outcome of the science, whether it's digital tech or other forms of tech. And to me, it's a fascinating object of study because of a whole bunch of reasons. And one of them is the really fundamental generative power of science as a human activity. Because once the knowledge frontier is pushed forward, it generally stays there. You don't lose it. 100 years later, that knowledge is still there. It's been built on. So it's a positive human activity. It's a constructive one. And it's something where even scientific progress 100 years ago can hugely impact what's happening today, and so on. And I think it's a very interesting arena in which the promise of human potential can really be significantly filled. So we're being a version of our best selves when we're pursuing knowledge, we're collaborating, when we have like a rational basis for interaction, and the products of that are so world-changing. So it held a fascination to me, both from a rational scientific point of view and from a humanities point of view, where kind of science fiction would be very interesting. But there were two moments, I think, which pushed me into academic inquiry, and they happened simultaneously. The one was the arrival of the Square Kilometre Array in South Africa, which, being interested in the world's best tech, was very capturing to me, because it was very superlative. They'd have the biggest telescope, the fastest processors, the most data, the kind of most James Bond lair headquarters. It was all up my street, and I thought, this is interesting, not as astronomy, but as a scientific enterprise to study as a social scientist. And then also, I had my first child, and I realized I needed to do a PhD. There was no more skirting that issue. So those two things came together. And it's been a fulfilling journey, because our work really impacts on science and tech. With tech, it's usually more practical. How do we keep AI in check so it doesn't infringe our rights, or how do we get the most social impact out of this or that venture? But it's also a science policy that speaks to our values. So how do we make it more inclusive? How do we bring the public on board? How do we bring stakeholders into the process? How do we align what we're researching with national priorities for people? So all of those things kind of came together to propel in that direction.
And just a follow-up question, Michael. Do you think, because obviously what I'm hearing you say is important, is how, this intersection of hard sciences and social sciences, or natural sciences and social sciences. And in your experience, your opinion, do you think that the divide between the natural and social sciences, or is it converging or is it diverging?
Well, it's simultaneously integrating and disintegrating. And I think that's really just a result of where those two concepts sit. Epistemologically, in terms of where the knowledge comes from. And that's where the interesting boundary is, because science asserts kind of objective knowledge on the basis of like a rational experimental method. And it can tell us a lot about the outer world, the composition of molecules, the effects of medicine, the orbits of planets. It can do all of those things, but it confronts real limitations when it comes to what it can tell us about our internal world. For example, one kind of area that skirts that boundary was Hedy van Rooyen's work on poetic inquiry, where there was an effort to bring poets together and social scientists together and try and circulate an understanding on that basis. But being part of that made it very clear to me that as superb as science is at understanding the external world, it really can't do what poetry does in understanding the internal world, and vice versa. And so bridging those two spaces is interesting, and it applies more generally, I think, the Kuhn kind of two cultures of science thing, where you have different cultures and different parts of science that have very different functions. So that's always been on the mind, but I think, when it comes to policy-oriented research, you somehow need to expand the imagination around those two things, around the kind of empirical stuff that's happening with science and the really social stuff that's happening to the public, and that's where your mindset needs to be, encompass those things in order to get the right perspective on the policy that mediates.
And then just to add on that, I'd like to know what you think is unique about South Africa in that convergence and divergence.
Sure. I mean,
just briefly, because I know you touched on the policy aspect of it as well.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of interesting things about South Africa. The one, I think, is historical context, and the one is kind of epistemological variance, as it were. And the historical context in all our work, in all the science policy work and the text policy work, there's always upfront an effort to address the past. And we have to address inequality, we have to address the digital divide, we have to address issues of women and girls in STEM, we have to address demographic kind of inequalities across the board, we have to build capabilities, and that's all socially contextualized science policy. And that's really critical. For example, engaged research, communication to various parts of the public. But there's also an epistemological level, which is really fascinating, in which it's really an imperative for us to recognize and support and learn from and codify indigenous knowledge, which is distinct from scientific knowledge. Indigenous knowledge doesn't arrive out of the application of scientific method, doesn't make the same claims to knowledge, but in South Africa's cultural context, we absolutely have to engage with it both as a de facto first point of call from a medical point of view for a lot of people, and also as a valid way of producing knowledge through different means.
Thank you so much, Michael. Denver, I would like to go to you to ask you about your experience of this convergence and divergence. Have you seen it converge or diverge? And I'm talking about now the natural sciences and the social sciences. So in your experience, have you seen that converge or diverge with contemporary society, changes in technology? If you could reflect on that, please, and then also contextualize it within the context of South Africa.
So in a sense, I think the issue of social science and the hard sciences, as it were, has in a sense mostly played out in my own head, because I've not really participated in work fora where I've physically had interacted with social sciences. However, the faculty has made a huge amount of strides in pulling in the social sciences, humanities into the Faculty of Health Sciences teaching and learning, just because there's a recognition that the social sciences plays a role that in fact the hard sciences can't full, as it were. And so there's been quite a big endeavor to make sure that that crossing over happens in the Faculty of Health Sciences. I've, on my part, in the space that I worked, also recognized the importance of indigenous knowledge, recognizing that it's not necessarily based on hard sciences, but there's certainly evidence there that probably needs to be followed up. And so the space where I came from, looking at compounds that may play a role in the treatment of diseases like cancer, it's always been interesting that we don't lose indigenous knowledge just because of the historical background that we've had in the country, where indigenous knowledge has been kind of considered unnecessary and certainly not something that people would want to, in fact, value. So I do think there's a recognition that we need to be looking at systems other than the hard sciences, and I'm thinking very specifically of indigenous knowledge, and asking how we can bring that into our current system of being. I don't think that we're there at the moment in fully recognizing and realizing that overlap, as it were, and bringing it closer. But there are certainly quite a number of people trying to make that jump from the hard sciences and pulling in the social sciences into what would be considered on science. And like Wieland, I agree, you can't really have a system in a country where you're only pushing the hard sciences and in fact pay no thought and effort at all. It has to always be money in terms of making sure that you support that component of human existence, really. So I think we do need to work harder at supporting both areas, and it's going to become difficult to do that given where we are financially as a country. But I think we don't do that. I think we do that at our detriment, I think.
I think so. And you, Prof, you reflect on 8 decades of life in your book. And you talk about your various interests, and you talk about growing up and experiencing different countries. And you've obviously seen the landscape of this country change in so many ways. And based on your experience, how have you seen the philosophical and the science? Have they converged? Have they diverged? Or has it been this continuous shaping and emergence over the years? And I want you to reflect on that, but specifically also in the context of South Africa.
Yeah, I think that I listened to what Michael said about the various aspects of the particular requirements in South Africa, what we have to look at and the kinds of things we have to consider. First of all, if I can make the comment that I believe that indigenous knowledge is actually scientific knowledge, because I don't know how else it would have been discovered in the first instance. I mean, there's no way in which at some time in the past a remedy was simply picked up from the ground and used to treat something. Somebody must have said, let's try this and let's see if it works, and let's see if it works again, let's see if it works again, and then it became part of indigenous knowledge. So there's no difference, if I can just make that comment, in the roots of it. There are parts of indigenous knowledge which depend on concepts of religion, religious aspects, and that's a different matter. But to get to your question, I think that I'm a very practical person. As if you read this book, you'll see that generally speaking, when people start spinning too many stories, I'm very focused on what I believe is concrete and what one should do and what one can do and how it can be done. That's the creativity of being able to find a way of solving a problem or improving a system and so on. So for example, there's been an unbelievable amount of talk about science, policy and innovation and so on and so forth. But when we built the academy, we found that there was an unbelievable ignorance of what those concepts were. Because our academy idea was getting away from prestige kind of people walking around saying, I'm a member of the academy, but saying, do something useful. Put perspectives together in a panel and say, what should we do about this problem of teenage pregnancies, for example? And then you put a team of people together, social scientists, endocrinologists and gynecologists and whatever, and educators and so on, and you put them all together and they would then come out with a set of recommendations of what would like to work. Now, we found that when we took those to the government departments, there was almost no interest. There was no receptiveness to this. Was done by the country's best brains in a country's new academy, and we had enormous difficulty getting government departments to take any notice. And so I must say I differ a bit from Michael, because I believe that ultimately you've got to know what the substance is of what you're talking about and how you can practically do something about it. That's what my section on action I told you about. I'm very much action-oriented in a creative way to find new ways of getting to a place which everybody else has tried to get to it, hasn't been able to go. Find a way of doing it. And science is a very good way of getting there, but not the only way. There are lots of other things you need to do. So you can, when we did the first study done by the Academy was a study of nutrition and HIV and AIDS. Now, we did it at the height of Mbeki and the Department of Health advocating nutritional solutions to the problem. And we wrote a report which Thabo Mbeki, as president of the country, took the trouble to write a 12-page critique in his weekly column called Africa Today, ANC Today.
Yeah.
And the thing is that in that he clearly got the message from us. He clearly understood what we were saying. That in fact is appalling nutrition in many parts of the country. And not only the poor people who are not poor were just as badly nourished. So there's a huge problem with nutrition. But is it the cause of the disease, etc.? And so we've clearly pointed out that it was a virus, and that this virus was real, and it was an infectious virus, and it spread this way, and so on. So So he actually read that and commented on it. And that, I must tell you, is the best response we ever had from any member of the government to our reports. So I'm washing a bit of dirty linen in public here because I believe it is time that we actually got down to the point of that it's a question of how do you tackle the problems of the country in a practical way, using the tools that are tried and trusted, and being creative about finding new ways and putting the best minds together to cross disciplines, putting them in a room and saying, sort it out, find a way, and let's give it resources and let's try it. So that's why I think you'll see that that's the fact that in each one of my endeavors, it was designed to do something and to get it right, to have an effect, and not just to talk.
Thanks so much, Prof. There's so much gravity to what you're saying, and I hope that our listeners are really listening to what you're saying and they're inspired about what you're saying. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our Connect, so I want to thank each and every one of you for your inputs, for your comments, for being here. It was a very insightful conversation. And Prof, to you, congratulations on this book, this memoir. It's an amazing read, and I hope it will inspire emerging and senior researchers alike. So, just in closing, I would like to read one of the lines from Prof's book. It's right at the end on page 301. He says, "That's what it's all about then, making your life in the face of chance and accident, loving to the fullest extent possible, and through your agency, positively affecting the lives of talented others, while leaving the world a slightly better place than you found it." Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed that. And next time, you'll see us on HSRC Connect, helping you navigate African realities. Thank you so much.